Christie was a monster that had been going for years and murdering girls left, right and centre.
In March 1953, police were called to number 10 Rillington Place in London. A tenant had uncovered remains of at least 3 bodies in her kitchen. Detectives believed the man responsible for these murders was the previous lodger, former police constable John Christie.
I think I was standing in the front room of this little house. I said to him, "What a terrible smell there is in this house, Christie." He said, "Yes." I spoke to him afterwards when he was being arrested, and when I said your wife's body was found under the floor, he said, "Yes." Now perhaps you realise what that smell was that you were talking about.
This is Matt from Underworld Uncut. This week, we're speaking to retired Metropolitan Police Inspector Len Trevallion. He met one of the 20th century's most notorious serial killers face to face. I wanted to know Len's first impressions of John Christie when they met.
We met him on 2 occasions. One, when I went to his house to tell him that I'd arrested one of his tenants who I saw stealing from a shop, and I followed him up to Christie's house. I felt I should go and tell the landlord that I'd got one of his tenants. And so later on I went up and told Christie, but then he was a war reserve working in North Kensington, Harrow Road, I think. And so I treated him as just as I would treat you. He was a little weakling, hadn't got any confidence in himself and so on. Well, I chatted to him. There was nothing unusual about him, and no character in him at all, just a bland, uninteresting face. And the next time I saw him, he was sitting in a cell. I was at Notting Hill in the station when I was called upon to sit in with him and chat to him, and he recognised me as being the person who had spoken to him some time before, when I went to his house. He was willing to chat, and having got this trouble, he knew he was for the drop. He was trying to talk naturally, and he told me what had happened, and I was able to ask him what had happened and why he did this, why he did that. And I was able to find out more in that, sitting with him at that mealtime, than anyone else had ever done before. He knew his end was due, and he wanted to get it all off his chest. He wanted to go away with a clean conscience, as it were.
John was born in Halifax, but by the start of the Second World War, he'd moved to London and was working as a special reserve constable for the Metropolitan Police.
The Metropolitan Police lost thousands of its men, in the Battle of Britain, or at least in the bombing afterwards. That's why the Metropolitan Police was short of manpower, and they had to enlist all sorts of people to patrol the streets and to deal with traffic problems and burst water mains and lights from buildings and so on, emanating from buildings, the blackout, and generally take over from what policemen used to do because they were so short of policemen. There was a chap who was in the police force, and he accepted me as on his own terms because I was a policeman, he was a policeman, at least he was a police reserve.
In November 1949, a concerned phone call from a Welsh lorry driver brought Len back to 10 Rillington Place, this time for something much more sinister.
I'd been a policeman in Putney, and after the war I got my promotion and went back promoted to Notting Hill as a sergeant. And I know the news came through on one occasion that Evans had phoned through from Wales or somewhere saying that there was a body down a drain hole. Well, they looked everywhere, couldn't find anything, but they searched and found in the outside loo there was a lot of timber and stuck on. There was the bodies in there, wrapped up, stuck in the back of this outside loo. Eventually, he was charged with the murder of his daughter Geraldine. And similarly, he was in the cell having his meal when I had a chance to sit in with him. And I spoke to him in the cell, and I said to him, I didn't have a long conversation. I said, I could understand you getting rid of your wife if she had had an abortion. I said, but not your little daughter Geraldine. He said, well, after my wife had gone, the crying of the baby got so incessant, I didn't know what it was driving me mad. And he said, I just put my hands around its mouth to shut it, to stop it from screaming and crying, and it died in my hands. So there was an admission of a murder, but had it gone alone on that, he would have got for manslaughter, wouldn't he? It wouldn't have been dealt with as murder, but I think he had a bad deal. I think manslaughter was the most he should have done because they couldn't prove the murder. He was a simple man.
It took the jury just 40 minutes to find Timothy Evans guilty for the murder of his daughter. He was hanged 3 months after the bodies of mother and child were discovered. No one thought to investigate Timothy's downstairs neighbours, John and Ethel Christie.
They had a very good relationship over the years. They were a little bit above the rest of the community because she was working, or he was working as a war reserve, getting money, and she, I think, had been a typist or something, and they had a little bit of more money than the rest of the community around there who were, living from hand to mouth. So they were a little bit better well off and able to earn a little money from letting. And this chap I'd chased, who'd stolen the biscuits and went into the house, Christie said he was owing him rent and the chap was just probably starving. And this biscuits was the first food he would have had for ages. So it was really the bottom end of the barrel down there in Rillington Place.
To understand more about John and Ethel's relationship, I first needed to build a clearer picture of Rillington Place itself.
It was a little cul-de-sac with a brick wall right across the road at the end of 10 Rillington Place, and the houses there were all occupied multi-tenancies, and North Kensington became isolated from South Kensington because South Kensington eventually became millionaires' properties. All these 5-storey or 4-storey houses with multi-tenancies emptied and restored, they could earn terrific rents. And there became a boundary between the ones that were full up and the ones that were empty and could be converted. And so Notting Hill became an area with the lower part down to Holland Park millionaires, and the upper part still the centre of where the Notting Hill Carnival now originates, all in that area, because all the properties have gained in worth because of their association with being in Notting Hill.
Len Trevallion has a theory about the Rillington Place murders and why so many women were turning up at John and Ethel's door.
She'd been having these girls called the prostitutes, and he helped her in this abortion procedure, and he had worked hand in glove with her for many years, doing this, as she thought, a good turn to the girls because she was a very clever abortionist. But they had this deck chair in the kitchen down below, and the girls would sit in this deck chair had strings across the base of it so that it was, virtually free. They'd lift the 2 legs up onto the kitchen table, and the girl with her legs apart, with her legs facing the table, his wife was able to perform the abortion, and many of the girls were 6 months gone, and so they had to administer a gas, or he had a rubber tube from the gas stove plugged into ordinary coal gas, and a tin mask, a tin fashioned like a mask at the end, and he used to put the girls out with coal gas. I said, why did you interfere with the supply of gas from the gas stove? He said, well, the smell was too much for the girls. He said, I tried to make it more pleasant. I cut in and say, how did you get rid of the fetuses? He said, well, wrap them in a bit of newspaper and throw them on a bomb site. He said the dogs and the rats would finish those fetuses off, and no one did know what happened, and no one would see them. So that little aspect, at any rate, I said to him, what happened after the girls were operated on? He said, well, we used to put them into the front room to recover. And this was his downfall. While Mrs. Christie was clearing up, he was in the front room having intercourse with the recovering girls or bodies.
There's much speculation about the Christie's underground abortion clinic. Len gave us more information about the sex trade at the time.
You remember it's after the war. Many people had lost their husbands, the girlfriends who'd had boyfriends killed in the war. So there were a lot of women with no men folk behind them. And the only way they could get a living was prostitution. And they graded from you get into Park Lane, the expensive high-class girls, through Bayswater Road to middle class, and then Notting Hill, and down the outskirts you get the cheap girls. So it was graded like from the centre of Mayfair to the outsides of Notting Hill, and the prostitutes, their prices varied accordingly. That I, in running the Vice Squad, knew how difficult it was to prove a brothel. You had to prove that they were prostitutes, so you had to get evidence that a girl was soliciting and receiving money. You had to prove that the lady of the house knew that they were prostitutes, and you had to say that you could see her taking money from them. And these things were almost impossible, without lying or exaggerating. You had to take a chance. So that's why the vice squad, dealing with this sort of thing, had to be in plain clothes. And that made them separate from the CID, because the CID wouldn't touch this type of crime. But the vice squad had to be in plain clothes in order to do this observation work.
Christie later told Len about what happened when Ethel caught him abusing the unconscious women.
He said, well, when he found me interfering with the girls, she threatened to expose me and tell the police about me. And we struggled, and I had an argument with her, and eventually I strangled her in the struggle. It was to stop her telling him, revealing his sordid behaviour with the girls. We know that there were 3 girls after Mrs. Christie died that came to the house. And if you can imagine a girl coming for an abortion to Mrs. Christie's house and she's not there, what's Christie going to do? He can't reveal that he's murdered his wife or why she isn't there. So he invites them in, sits them in the chair, gives them gas until they're right out. And then he can dispose of the body. But before he does so, he has, I don't know how long, but he has a lot of time with this dead body to practice his necrophiliac desires. He was full of regret and would have told me the very last thing that I asked of him. He was pleased to get it off his chest. I did say to all these last 3 girls, they were pregnant. He said, I couldn't tell them that my wife was not there to do the abortion. He said, so I had to keep them quiet. And if they came, I realised that if we're dead, they couldn't talk and talk about it. He said 1, and then I hoped there would be no more, but then in due course there were 2 others came. He said, and I dealt with them the same way. He said, but I'm afraid each one of them I did indulge in sexual intercourse with them when they were dead.
Christie stowed the bodies of Kathleen Maloney, Rita Nelson and Hectorina McLennan in a small alcove behind his kitchen wall. One of the bodies had been left there for 64 days.
When I went up to tell Christie about this arrest that I'd made in his house afterwards, I interviewed him in his front room. In conversation, I said to him, what a terrible stink you've got in this house, Christie. Can't you do something about it? He said, these tenants that I've got, they have funny procedures in their cooking, and they cook peculiar things, and it gives a funny smell right through the house. And I thought, well, that doesn't fit in with this. And I didn't realise then that I was standing over the remains of his wife under the floorboards. What could I have done? I wasn't a detective. I wasn't, the CID to investigate crimes, and smells were something I was accustomed to in those days. Every low-down dwelling had smells, horrible smells.
Christie moved out of 10 Rillington Place in March 1953, but the house was far from empty. After his former neighbour discovered the bodies in the alcove, there was an extensive police search of the home.
We used to walk through the house and ask how things were going. There were a couple of young cadets digging the garden and so on. And when they were digging in the garden, they did find skeleton or bits of a skeleton of 2 girls. And when I went through, I saw a rubbish heap just outside the back door, below the window from the downstairs kitchen room, and a heap of rubbish. And I saw a clean box, a gold leaf tobacco tin. And I thought, that's new. I picked it up and opened it, and it was full of hairs. I couldn't make out. And then I realised there were pubic hairs. And it was packed solid with pubic hairs. He must have taken a trophy from every girl he'd ever been through and put the pubic hairs in this little tin. It was packed solid. So I handed it to the detective inspector and told him what it was. And he was a little bit didn't want the uniform branch interfering with his investigation, because theoretically he should have had the forensic department go through that box and identify how many girls were there. And I know that was true, because later on, when they had the Black Museum and I was able to film, and I was able to look at that box again, and opened it. It had about 5 little tufts of hairs in, so the forensic department had disposed of all of the others and left only those remaining to the bodies that they had or could identify.
The 2 bodies unearthed in the garden were 21-year-old Ruth First and 31-year-old Muriel Eady. bringing the total number of victims found at Rillington Place to 8. As news of the horrific discovery spread, Christie was sleeping rough on the streets of London. He was eventually tracked down and arrested near Putney Bridge.
When he was eventually arrested just over on Putney Bridge there, that's where the boat race starts, I just remember that spot because I used to be a policeman at Putney and I know exactly where he was arrested and I know the chap who arrested him. Now, he was almost relieved to have an end to his life. You know, he realised that he had run his race and that's where he was, and he was, I think, pleased to be picked up, and I think in the last day he'd slept rough somewhere along Putney Embankment, and I think when he was arrested he was pleased that it was over.
Over the next 3 months, Christie gradually confessed to the murders of all 8 victims, including his wife Ethel and Beryl and Geraldine Evans, whose deaths had led to Timothy Evans being executed. What I find particularly fascinating is that Christie tried to plead insanity as a part of his defence. I was curious to know what Len made of this.
He wasn't insane. He was very, very sane. He knew exactly what he had done and he tried to clear his conscience. You see, the CID would have only taken statements from him under caution. That satisfied them. They had sufficient evidence to prosecute him for the murder of his wife. End of chapter. Once they'd got that, he was a free man to talk and chat. Nothing was taken. He knew from his experience as a policeman that nothing he said then could be used against him or would be used against him. And so he was able then to chat and tell me exactly what happened and why it happened. I didn't treat him as a serial killer. I knew that he'd had to get rid of 3 girls that came to him after his wife was dead. And I know that he was so weak-willed, or he was so struck with his obsession, that he thought, here's an opportunity to do what I've always wanted, have a girl to me own, a baby doll, as it were. One, and then another one, another. And that was, then he realised he'd gone too far.
So this got me thinking, could there have been more victims?
It could have been. I mean, can you imagine the detective inspector then starting up, where do I go from here? How far back do I have to go to trace these other girls that have been through his hands? The CID inspector realised that he'd got a job there. If he followed it through every aspect of it, it'd be there for months. So as soon as he got the evidence from Christie that he'd murdered his wife, they shut off, said, that's all we want, no more evidence. We've got enough to do there. If we start digging into all these bodies and who were their relatives and how did he kill them, they'd be there for years. It was a very interesting one because of the fact that the full story wasn't known. Only they picked on the headlines, the mass murderer or the mass sadist, and left it at that. It was when Ludwig Kennedy thought he'd write a story about it all, and he started on the Christie, ignoring his wife's abortion side of it. He thought that Christie was a monster that had been going for years and murdering girls left, right and centre. It was only later, when his wife was dead, that he had an opportunity of these 3 girls that came one after the other to him for their abortions, and Mrs. Christie couldn't do it, and he had to dispose of them without any evidence following on.
Despite his confessions, John Christie was only tried for the murder of his wife Ethel. His plea of insanity was rejected, and on the 25th of June 1953, the jury found him guilty of Ethel's murder. He was hanged at HMP Pentonville the following month by the infamous executioner Albert Pierpoint. In October 1966, Timothy Evans was officially pardoned for the murder of his daughter Geraldine, and capital punishment in the UK was abolished a few years later. Thanks for joining us for Len Trevallion's reflections on the horrific Rillington Place murders. For more stories like this, be sure to like and subscribe, and comment below what stories you'd like to see on the channel. We've also just launched memberships for anyone who'd like to support the channel and help us keep creating content. More information is in the description below. This is Matt from Underworld Uncut. See you on the next one.